when you start researching, you never know what doors are going to open. And today my talk is, I started with one idea and it's ended up being totally different. And I think you'll realize that as I've gone through, what I'm trying to say in the whole thing is, don't make your genealogy research a silo. We tend to think, those of us who've worked in government have known for years that there's been many silos across the government, even within departments, that don't talk to each other. Well, research, in my case, has been very enlightening and opening. I started, I'll say, with a public service career, and they've intermeshed my genealogy, research, and public service career. With Agriculture Canada, I was in enforcement for the better part of 15 years working there. With that, I learned that there's processes you follow. You want repeatability in those processes, that if I do it for sample A or whatever, and do it in sample C, I should get similar style results. So the same process idea works with research. The main thing out of all my years in Agriculture Canada was follow the clues you're given and the information. When I say enforcement, it was, in essence, frontline enforcement. I would write reports that went to Department of Justice, and there were convictions from it. So it was a case of, I've got clues have come along, I've written a report on these clues. I don't speculate on what can happen, I leave that to Justice Department. Then I started a job with Industry Canada, and it ended up being a research assistant. But one of the skills that I put in my application for the job was, it was an acquired skill. It was not a skill that I got through my employment. The skill was research, because I'd started doing genealogy research. It was a transferable skill. And with the Industry Canada one, it was researching assistant for 12 plus years. I did a lot of researching on the internet. I learned how to search through databases and the good and bad search engines on each database. So I've used those skills that I've had from public service employment back into genealogy research. The best thing I'll tell you is networking. I have a network of friends here doing genealogy. I have go-to people. I'm not the expert on Scotland. I will call up or send Ken McKinley an email. What can you do? If it's military, it's Glenn. DNA, English questions, I will tend to ask John Reed, where do I go for advice? Brian, Glenn and I work together in doing research in the Pontiac. So we have a network of people here. Networking in genealogy, in any type of research, is invaluable. I did a DNA test, and I got some very unexpected results as a result of that DNA test. Yeah, who do you think you are? A friend had a contract with them. For personal reasons, was unable to fulfill it. They needed someone here in Ottawa to do research. Recommended me. First one that I did research on was the Bryan Cranston show. And I learned. In all my research, I have learned something. With Bryan Cranston's Irish ancestor that settled in Montreal, 1850s, married, had a child. Ancestor takes off. Male ancestor takes off. leaving his wife and child. The child was placed into the equivalent of a poorhouse in Montreal. I never realized that in the 1850s and 60s and beyond, we had, in essence, poorhouses in cities. This one was operated by a benevolent society in Montreal. When I actually got into the records of that in place, it had reinvented itself a number of times through to about the 1950s when it was closed. With that, I learned how to access restricted documents at Library and Archives Canada, the room you view them in, what hoops you jump through to be able to, one, look at these documents, and two, can you copy them? So it was a learning experience with that. The one I enjoyed the most, Chris Knott. How many of you realize the show was done, a really good show, and it centered on his ancestor from Cavan, Ireland, who was in the Peninsular Wars? How many of you realize he has an Ottawa connection? Yes, that ancestor that was in the Peninsular Wars went back to Cavan, married, wife and her children came to Gloucester Township. 1850s, they're in Gloucester Township. The child that was born in Ireland, 1861 census, is up in Alumet Island as a farmer, then moves to Chicago. One of the things I had to do for that show was to find out how the Chicago fire was reported in the Ottawa newspapers. And surprisingly, when I looked at a sibling of his ancestor that was in Alumet Island, I do know some of the descendants of the aunt. Then I did a DNA test. Grandmother was a home child. We know nothing beyond grandma, and she had two sisters. And if we were trying to find any descendants of those two sisters, our only chance, because I cannot find them anywhere in any of the documentation I've looked at, would be do a DNA test and hope for the best. Well, I did a DNA test, and if you have put up a family tree with your DNA, and my family tree is only 112 names, ancestral tree with a couple of side people, siblings in places where I was doing some fishing. DNA circles. Ancestry will look at your DNA and compare it to the other people whose you match, have DNA matches, but they're trees. I have 425 of us that are descended from Samuel Meacham in the US. Now with this family, his grandfather and great-grandfather in 1690 were in Salem, Massachusetts. And this family, I have, before I did DNA testing, about 4 years ago, there were about 8 of us, Meacham family researchers, 2 here in Ottawa, myself and another person in Ottawa. The rest were in the US, and we were filling in the family tree. But from that, I got copies of 2 diaries. One that was grandson of Samuel's, who was also a brother of my 3rd great-grandfather. And in it, I had the proof on when my ancestor came to Canada from the US after the War of 12 to 14. And it said he came back to New York State, visited his family, and said he was going to Canada because there was better trapping and hunting up in Canada than there was in New York State. His father had managed to have been the best trapper in all of northern New York State, so I'm not surprised he would want to move on. And because of that, I got that diary. I also got a diary of another cousin that had been written at the time of the murder of Joseph Smith in Nauvoo, Illinois, because that family moved with Joseph Smith. So you never know where you're going to get copies of something like that that'll give extra meaning to your family. There's other circles, not as prolific as that one, but it works. Now, the unexpected results. Beginning of April last year, I got an email through Ancestry, and it was a gentleman by the name of Liam, said, "First, I'd like to congratulate you on the well-sourced family tree you have up on Ancestry." Hey, if I'm helping teach a course, and we're telling people to cite where you found something, I better do it myself. Okay, and he said, "Susan Quayle married James Moore." He said, "We knew that. We had the marriage registration in Liverpool, England, but nobody knew what happened to them, where they went, whatever." Well, Susan Quayle that married James Moore is my great-grandmother. He says, "I have the tree online, look at it." And he said, "Did you know Susan's sister Jane also came to the Ottawa area?" My response was, "Yeah, I knew about Jane. I am in close contact with her descendants." But when I looked on his tree, here was the church baptismal record of my great-grandmother. We're both still looking to see who Fanny's surname is. Nobody has it. And when I responded back to him, I said, "Where do you fit in this family of Quayles?" And he said, "I don't. But I live in Ballamore, County Leitrim, Ireland, which is where my Quayle family came from." And he says, "All the Canadian researchers that have done work on them have gotten it wrong." So he says, "I have gone through church records, any of the records in Ballamore to sort the families out." The great thing was, John Quayle, to be my second great-grandfather, he had him there. We can get John's, he has John's father, John's two uncles, do not know the name of John's grandfather, but with the tree, he had set together in the families, the people that I had here in Canada as orphans, because I didn't know where they fit within the family. I knew they were related because an obituary said the cousin of James Quayle that ran the hotel down at number 2 Elgin Street in the turn of the century, he was a cousin. Well, this fit it through, it brought together the families up in the Pontiac that were there, where they fit in. And when I then looked at my research and looked at it all, and I said, my response back to him was, "I think you're missing a sister of John's, because she was in Canada and she just fit right in between all the other siblings he had of John's." And it explained, using cluster migration, the explanation was very clear to me why her nieces and nephews came to Canada and came to the Pontiac, most of them. Susan and James were here in Ottawa. James was a shoemaker. He worked for Carson's. Mrs. Carson came from the Pontiac. Her grandmother was a Quayle. So you get all these families, interconnection. You never know where it's going to come from. This was the best thing out of it all. And publishing. First book, The Church of England Parish Registers of North Clarendon Thorne in Pontiac County. Jerry Neville, one of the founding people in BIFHSGO, about 1995, 96, said, Gloria, you're from up there. Have you been looking at this parish record? Reel of microfilm at the library? And I said, yes, going through it. He says, what do you say we transcribe it? So I got permission from the archivist at the Anglican Archives, and because this is out in public domain, was in public domain at Library and Archives Canada, at the Quebec Bank, BANQ at Quebec Archives, he said, it's in public domain, you may as well go ahead and do it, someone else will if you don't. Jerry and I purposely did not put the witnesses to any of the baptisms, marriages, and deaths, burials on there because we wanted people to go and look at the reel of film, to look at the record themselves. That was a start. It got published 1998. There were 2 of them we did. 2010, I did an article, Year of the Home Child. I did an article on researching my grandmother from leaving England till she got into a family in the Pontiac. As a result of that, the editor of the Shawville Equity, with the publisher standing behind her, asked me to do a genealogy column for their paper. 170 some columns later, I sort of said enough, because I'm not, at that point, I was not doing enough research in the Pontiac area to sort of meet the new publisher's idea. But when I did an article, I would take a source, describe what it was, tell what information I got from it, and it was usually look beyond, the obvious. There can be some stuff there that you're missing. Then Sandra Roberts and I were talking one day at a home child event, and she said, I wish there was a book for people on how to start doing research on their home children. I said, well, I got a bunch of articles that I've written. I've done talks, my stuff from talks, handed my folio to Sandra. She put together my book. Rick did the front cover, and it was done that the book would sell for under $20. That was, we wanted something that would be sell easy, and as I said to Rick, $20 today at a genealogy conference is the $5 that we were spending in the 1990s. So he did it this way, coil bound. And what was surprising to me is both Rick and Sandra said to me with this was, there's sources and resources that you have put in your columns that we never knew existed and how to use them. And they'd been in the business for 25 years. This book, yes, it has that title, but some of the articles in it, I know were not written home child oriented, but Rick and Sandra figured because of the genealogy benefit people might get from them. That was how this book came together. So as I say, research has opened many doors for me in many ways. Most of it has been networking. A lot of it has been networking. And it's been the unexpected results to me that have been more worthwhile than just the genealogy door that's open for me. So I hope I have enlightened you to think beyond your box of genealogy research.